Now we're going to look at finding the domain for the following functions. And domain, remember, is your input. And these particular functions that we're looking at are the square root functions. They're radical functions. They're what we call radical functions. You've got square root, you've got cube root, you've got fourth root. These are all square root. They're radical functions. So when we're finding the domain of a radical function, remember, domain is your input, range is your output. Domain is your x, range is your y. So when we're looking at these, x is your domain, which is your input, and y is your range, which is your output. And so when we're looking here for domain, that means we're going to be looking at all of our x values. What can we input? What values can we input into these functions and they actually give us an output? Because you're not always going to get an output from certain inputs. The examples I always use a vending machine. If you're at a Coca-Cola machine and you put your money in for your input, you're not going to be able to get a Pepsi product as your output because it's a Coke machine. If it's a soda machine, you're not going to put your money in as the input and get a bag of chips as the output unless it's a magic soda machine. The only thing you can get, your range, is the sodas. Your domain is the money you put in. So we're looking at what can we plug in to these equations. Now again, going back to the vending machine or the soda machine, your domain is going to be what you can actually input. If I walk up to a soda machine, I'm not going to be able to input a $100 bill. I'm not going to be able to input a penny. I'm not going to be able to input a 50-cent piece. I'm not going to be able to input a $50 bill. So the domain is restricted. There's only certain coins and currency that I can put into that machine. So my domain is going to be restricted to dimes, nickels, quarters, $1 bill, $5 bill. Those are usually the ones that you can put into a vending machine. So those would be your inputs. The outputs would obviously be, you would be restricted to what's in the vending machine, what could come out depending on the money you put in. So with all that being said, let's look at these here. I want to find the inputs. Well, when you have a radical function, you have to consider the type of radical it is. Here we have a square root. And the rules for square roots indicate that you cannot have a negative number under the square root sign. You cannot take the square root of a negative number. So the smallest value I would be able to get here would be 0. If I got anything less than 0, there is no output because I can't get my output because I can't square root it. I can't get an answer. So I know that x plus 4 has to be larger than or equal to 0 in order for this function to work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to solve it. I'm going to move the 4 over. We don't have to flip the symbol because that's only when you're dividing by a negative. So x has to be larger than or equal to negative 4. That is your domain. What if it's not larger than negative 4? What if I tried to plug in negative 5? Negative 5 plus 4 would give me a negative 1, and I can't take the square root of a negative number. So that is how you find the domain. Same thing here. Don't worry about this 8. We have to find out what it is I can input into the function. Well, I know what's underneath the square root sign has to be 0 or larger. You can't take the square root of anything negative. So I know that x minus 5 has to be larger than or equal to 0. Has to be. Again, I solved that, so I'm going to add the 5 to both sides. So x has to be larger than or equal to 5, and that is my domain. And let's look at the last one. And again, this is what you're focusing on, what's underneath the radical. I know that x plus 16 has to give me something that is greater than or equal to 0. If it doesn't, then I have a negative. I can't take the square root of a negative, therefore I won't get an output. I won't get a y value. So I'm going to solve this. I'm going to subtract 16. So x has to be greater than or equal to negative 16. So that is how you find the domain of a square root function, which falls under the umbrella of radical functions. The domain is what can we input into the equation and get a real output, not an imaginary one, not a square root of a negative number, something we have to get an answer that we can tangibly graph and measure.